Well, good evening. Tonight, I'd like to continue our lesson. Last Sunday, we talked about the providential necessity of God equipping us as saints for the ministry, and that's a good and noble thing that we studied. But how do we practically apply that then? And this lesson is not going to have a ton of scriptural references. We're going to look at a lot of the same ones we looked at last time in Ephesians chapter 4. And I threw in 4 through 6 there because, of course, the armor of God is in chapter 6 of Ephesians. And it's a good representation of how we can practically apply those things to us. So, last time we had this little bailout bag, I call him Bob, on our boat. And the rule on our boat is you grab Bob before you save anybody else. Because if you don't have Bob, you're not going to get saved. And so we need to look for those things that are practically that we can have, like on the last slide, the armor of God, that we can apply to ourselves, that we can then apply to other people also. So in our previous lesson, we made the observation that the church has certain gifts, and that those gifts included in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. Those gifts included evangelists, pastors, and teachers, and that the goal of those people is to equip the saints for ministry. There we go, Ephesians chapter 4, and starting about verse 7. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to each man. And then in verse 11 it says, and he gave the apostles, the prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. So the Lord is still building his church today. So we know that at least evangelists, pastors, and teachers are all involved with that growing. And we know that the office or the position of pastor is the same as elder and is the same as shepherd in the Bible. They're all three the same office. There's not one who's elevated to a higher degree than the others. We learned about that a few months ago, and that was one of the first heresies that came about, and the reason why we have certain denominations today is because of elevating one man above the rest of the group. And not to get too far off track there, but so the point is that the Lord is still building his church today, and he's opening doors. We looked at that last time. For those who are prepared to serve. Acts chapter 14, 1 Corinthians 16, Colossians 2, Colossians 4. He opens doors for those who are prepared to serve. If you're not prepared to serve, even if there is an open door in front of you, you can't take advantage of it. So if we desire that the Lord opens doors for us, we need to be prepared to serve. And not just in the congregation, but as individuals also. So we have a providential necessity. God calls certain things to happen. God is in control, and so he can open doors for us, those types of things. That's what I'm calling a providential necessity, to be concerned with the equipping of the saints. So, but really, before I go any further, I thought it might be good for us to study what I call the practical necessity. These are practical necessities to survive if you're out in the woods. There's signaling devices. There's duct tape, which is everything. That's Band-Aids and everything, right? It fixes everything. So those practical necessities, I want to look at some of those things. because any congregation that wants to grow really needs to give serious consideration to equipping the saints for ministry. I keep saying that over and over because that's the theme of what I want to talk about for the next couple Sundays. And so to kind of understand what I'm trying to say there about maintaining consistent growth and even starting to grow as a group, I was very encouraged this morning. We had 2 visitors, and that was a really good thing. But to maintain those things, it takes some effort. And so many churches don't really have a problem with people coming in the door, especially if you're in a populated area. If you have population in the area, there is at least some percentage of the population that is going to come in the door. And even if you're very diligent about spreading the gospel and people are obedient to the Lord, you'll have people coming in. And other people, like I was saying, live in more populated areas that are growing, and so you have people moving into the church. But the problem is not generally people coming in the doors. It's keeping those people or keeping members. So they'll lose members just as fast as they're getting them. And so one of the other problems is that new converts, people who are just converted to the faith, who are just baptized, are weak in the faith, and they begin to drift away. And Christians new to the area, they'll attend for a while, and then they'll look elsewhere, or they'll let it fall off. And so it's really been well documented that churches can't really, or have a difficult time breaking beyond certain mental barriers. And there's a lot of them that have been discussed: the 75-person barrier, the 200-person barrier, and both of those are related to what's called group dynamics. It's related to the principles that affect the people's ability to relate to one another in a particular group. But the problem, so when I say that, group dynamics is what it boils down to. What it boils down to is that growth doesn't continue because people are not being assimilated into the family life of the congregation. So some people don't really care or know about church growth. They might be happy to maintain the status quo, but we're talking about souls here. These are people who need to be in that right relationship with God. There's an urgency there. These are not numbers that we're trying to pump up, to make our bonus in heaven. That's not what we're trying to do. And so any true Christian is going to have concern for his fellow man, for the body of Christ. And so the solution to what I call the revolving door syndrome, is actually several points. And I'm going to quote. I don't normally do this. Let me just put a bunch of preferences out there, prefaces. I don't normally do this, but I'm going to be quoting a man who's not inspired for a lot of things tonight. And he's been associated with the Churches of Christ for 60 or 70 years. He's been a full-time minister for 50 years. And he's also a professor of statistics and psychology. And his name is Flavel Yakeley. I don't know if you know the name. And he teaches, he retired, I guess, about 10 years ago or less than 10 years ago from Harding. And he's been looking at stats in the church for 40 years. And his work in the church really can provide us with this lens into how we can view the historical trends in the church. So there's a book he wrote called Why Churches Grow, and it really emphasizes the point that every member being involved in some way or another. So the more involved a person is in the work of the congregation, the more important the congregation becomes in his own life. And so it follows then, when we think about it logically, that a congregation which offers people opportunities for involvement is going to be more successful in attracting and keeping those converts than would a congregation who has fewer involvements, opportunities for involvement. So let me just read a quote from him. And it says, "The more involved a person becomes in the work of a congregation, the more important the congregation becomes in his life." Let me read another one. Sorry, I was moving on from that one. Total evangelism includes more than teaching the lost. It includes involving the members of the work of the local congregation. So we as a group need to involve each one of us. Each one of us has a role, and when we learn what that role is, then we will be more likely not only to influence other people outside of the church, but also feel like we're supposed to feel. The church is a family. We're together. And when we do those things, we have a bond, not only with ourselves, but it strengthens the bond between us and God. And so the congregations with the highest dropout rate he found were the congregations with the lowest involvement level. So individuals weren't involved in the church, whether it was even simple things like leading a prayer or being involved in the physical maintenance of the building, feeling like you have ownership of the group. So if a congregation can maintain that higher level of involvement, its conversion rate will not only be higher because people feel like they're needed, but its dropout rate is going to be lower, and so net growth rate then will be higher. So the main idea is get involved. And this is not just for other people to do, but this is for me to do. So if you feel like you haven't been involved in the church, get involved. The second point is get involved. The challenge of involving members is that, and Yakeley addresses this in his book. He says that, in other words, larger congregations might actually have more than enough specific task assignments to go around, but the members may not be aware of the many ways they could get involved. So we found that large groups that couldn't retain people who came in and left, felt like they didn't know how to be involved. They didn't know their place in the group. And so when he addresses those, the challenges that each congregation faces, it involves every member, especially when it starts to grow. So in general, he says the larger the congregation, the lower the involvement level. Why does the involvement level tend to decrease as size increases? He says the problem with the larger congregations is that they have not been able to increase the number of task assignments fast enough to keep pace with the expanding membership. So people come and they feel like everything's already being done, and they're not actually needed. There's not a place for them there. And so, but in actuality, the real problem was not always the actual roles that these members, or roles to member ratio. There wasn't like, there was song leaders and people serving on the table and greeters at the door and people maintaining the building. The problem was not always the number of roles to the number of people, but it was the perceived notion of roles to people. When people said, "Oh, well, there's already people doing those things, they don't really need me. I'm not needed here. I feel like I'm an outsider. I'm outside of the group." So in other words, the larger congregation might actually have more than enough specific task assignments to go around, like I'm reading, but the members might not be aware of the ways they could get involved. So if a congregation has a good ratio of roles to members, but a low perceived ratio, the problem there is communication. A congregation can have high involvement no matter how large it becomes. Everybody can be involved in the group if that congregation will do what's necessary to organize itself and organize the work so that everybody knows their place, knows what they can do. And the people in the congregation, the leaders will need to communicate in the right way as to have that perceived high ratio of roles to members. So the challenge is not just something that for people to do, but for letting them know what is available to do. So when we talk about equipping the saints for ministry, it's a practical necessity as well as a providential one. Yes, God calls us to do it. Now the question is, how do we do it? How do we know what my place is in the church? Well, we come together as a group and we talk about it. We communicate those things. If we want the Lord to open doors for us so we can be used by Him to reach the lost, we need to equip ourselves then to be of the service. That's the providential necessity. If we want those who come our way to feel that this congregation is important to them and vice versa, they are important to the congregation, we need to provide the opportunity for every member to serve. That's the practical necessity there. So if we desire growth as a member of the church, every member then, not just a few members, every member must do their part. And you have to know what your part is. And so if the body of Christ is going to grow as it should, let's read Ephesians 4:16. Oh man, Ephesians is like one page in this thing because it's microprint. There we go. Ephesians 4, chapter 4 and verse 16. Well, let me back up to 15. It says, "Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint which is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love." So how is each part, that's you and me, how are we held together? It says we're held together, each joint is held together with which it is equipped. So when we equip ourselves for the work of the church, and when we work properly, it says, we're held together in a group and we're doing what God intended us, what's the outcome? Makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. And so I think we've emphasized the need in these first couple lessons to equip the saints for the ministry. And I think our next study then is going to focus on the diversity of the function of the body of Christ. This hasn't been a necessarily come to Jesus type of lesson, but if you have a need, if you've got things in your life that have been bothering you and you're ready to give those things up, and you haven't obeyed the gospel, or maybe you have and you've fallen backwards and you'd like to become more involved in the work here, please let me know or let somebody else know. And let's all stand and we'll sing this last couple songs.